And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today's December the 4th, 338th day of the year. Just 27 days remain to the year's over with. And it'll be time to look at a new year. Holidays, observances. It's National Cookie Day, Cabernet Franc Day. It's a glass of this wine variety unveils a world of rich flavors and unique characteristics. World Wildlife Conservation Day, International Cheetah Day, National Dice Day. Get ready to roll those endless possibilities. These small cubes hold a key to a whole lot of fun and excitement and endless entertainment. National Sock Day, Santa's List Day, Wearing Brown Shoes Day, Extraordinary Work Team Recognition Day, Celebrate Shelter Pets Day. You know, no matter where you're at, somewhere in your town is a animal shelter with pets who are looking for their forever home. Zagreb Advent, National Cookie Cutter Week, Crohn's and Colitis Awareness Week, Advent, Artis Mundi, National Influenza Vaccination Week, Older Driver Safety Awareness Week, Inclusive School Week, Hornbill Festival. Now that is a fascinating celebration, brings together various tribes in Nagaland in India. It's a colorful event that showcases traditional music and dance and art, showcases the rich culture and heritage of the Naga people. Visitors from around the world actually come to experience this lively festival. It's something you can long remember. And of course, it's Blue Christmas until December 31st. While most people are sitting at home, warm, safe, opening presents, emergency workers are on duty, ensuring the safety of the communities over the holidays. Famous people born on this date: Jay-Z, Marissa Tomei, Fred Armisen, and Jeff Bridges. Well, with all that having been said, let's see what stories we have in the news. President Trump's Venezuela gamble leaves Russia and China puzzled as tools to pressure Maduro actually dwindle. His standoff with Maduro deepens. Experts warn the next move may force a showdown. Absent direct military action, President Trump's running low on options amid his standoff with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. That's according to the experts. And no matter where you go, there's an expert about something. Strikes near Venezuelan waters aimed at the drug traffickers, sanctions, and the $50 million bounty have so far been unsuccessful in forcing Maduro, whom the U.S. has designated a leader of the Tren de Agua drug cartel, to step down from power. After repeated threats, adversaries may now view a lack of direct military action as a sign of weakness from the U.S., but Maduro's in an equally difficult position. His own military capabilities are dwarfed in comparison to President Trump's, and experts say China and Russia lack the will to directly challenge the U.S. in its own hemisphere. And the clock is ticking. President Trump's unprecedented military buildup in the Caribbean, including sending the world's largest aircraft carrier to the region, is taking away resources from other theaters, which may or may not have negative connotations. Well, there's a set of twin brothers from Virginia been arrested for allegedly plotting to destroy government databases. They were arrested for their alleged roles in deleting government databases hosted by a federal government contractor. That's according to the Justice Department. Munib and Sohaib Akhtar, both 34, were indicted last month for supposedly conspiring to delete databases used to store U.S. government information. That's according to the DOJ. The arrests come after Bloomberg News reported in May the brothers allegedly compromised data across several agencies, including the IRS and General Services Administration. They pled guilty in 2015 to federal charges of conspiracy in connection with data breaches at the State Department and a cosmetics company. Both served multiple years in prison before landing jobs as engineers for OPEX's federal contractor and helps process U.S. government records. And after their termination as federal contractors, they allegedly attempted to harm their former employer and the U.S. government customers by accessing computers without authorization, issuing commands to bar others from modifying the databases before they were removed, deleting databases, stealing information, destroying evidence of their activities. In February, Munib Akhter deleted nearly 100 databases storing U.S. government information. Many of the databases containing Freedom of Information Act records administered by the federal government, as well as sensitive investigative files of federal government components. At least that's according to the indictment. And about a minute after deleting the databases, Munib Akhter allegedly asked an artificial intelligence tool how to clear system logs in deleting the databases. They also talked about cleaning out their house in anticipation of a police search. Company laptops used by the pair were wiped before they were returned to the federal contractor. So actually, they've been busy destroying everything they could get their little hands on. Well, a British man says he was arrested after posting photos while he was holding guns during a 4th of July trip to Florida. He's a British IT consultant, says he lived through a dystopian nightmare after being arrested for posting photos of himself holding firearms during a trip to the U.S. John Richelieu Booth, owner-director of Phoenix Evolution Consulting, told Fox News the trouble began after he visited friends in Florida over 4th of July to celebrate the holiday and also his 50th birthday. During the visit, he said he was invited to shoot a gun for the first time. They were shooting, and they offered him the opportunity, which, as a Brit who'd never handled guns, he needed some instruction. After he got back home and to the UK, posted a series of photos about his trip to LinkedIn. Day 2 after he shared the photos, the police showed up at his house to tell him somebody had made a complaint. They warned him to be careful about what he posts online. 10 days later, he said the police came back, forced their way into his house at 10:30 p.m. and arrested him. He was told the arrest stemmed from the firearm photos and the separate post authorities claim amounted to stalking and harassment. He was questioned and held overnight before being released. About 7 weeks later, he said he was arrested again on an allegation he'd breached bail, which he says was based on a false complaint. And the complaint was tied to a dispute with a former client, according to the accused. He said, I'd contracted to this gentleman's business to deliver works for the government, and those works were still unpaid 2 years later, he said. He explained a business partner taking a photo outside the man's home while delivering a final demand notice. The step, he said, was lawful because the photo was taken from a public area. And the arrest was based on 2 separate social media posts. One was the photo of himself with the shotgun, which you can tell I'm terrified of. First time I'd held it, and you can see how I'm holding it. And the second one was my LinkedIn banner at the top of the page. So in England, you can even think about doing something and get arrested. Well, Ryan Sherhott exposes America's new real estate reality and the biggest housing shift in 50 years. He's a celebrity broker, says wealthy Americans are buying multiple homes in different cities while luxury real estate rebounds in New York City. He says the housing market isn't broken, it's actually transforming itself. He said America's entered nobody's market, a reality where buyers and sellers are equally stuck and the old rules don't apply anymore. And out of that confusion, he says, a seismic shift is happening. Wealthy Americans aren't picking one place to live anymore, but rather choosing portfolios of cities, a trend he calls the biggest change in U.S. housing market in 50 years. It's not a buyer's market. It's not a seller's market. It's nobody's market because rates are high and they're not coming down substantially anymore. Well, we're happy with one house. Well, Judge Boasberg, the one that they've tried to impeach, reversed his course on the January 6th defendants pardoned by President Trump. The U.S. District Judge James Boasberg on Wednesday ordered 2 January 6 defendants pardoned by President Trump to be refunded in full for restitution payments made and fines incurred as part of their earlier criminal cases. It's a reversal of his position from just a few months ago when the same judge rejected their bid for repayment. Boasberg used a memo order Wednesday to outline the fairly complex case history for Cynthia Ballinger and her husband, Christopher Price, both of whom have been tried and convicted on misdemeanor charges in connection with the events of January 6, 2021. They've been ordered to pay hundreds of dollars in assessment fees and restitution. So his order now effectively clears the way for the government to refund them both in full. Well, there's so many different questions about the January 6th situation. Well, Miami mayoral candidates revealed how he's going to flip the script on Democratic rivals' city of renters strategy. Miami Republican mayoral candidate Emilio Gonzalez is accusing his progressive Democratic opponent, Eileen Higgins, of wanting to create a city of renters despite pushing a message of affordability. Instead, he's proposing a plan to turn Miami into a city of owners. Gonzalez and Higgins will face off in a runoff election December 9th after none of the candidates got 50% of the vote in election night, November 4th. Higgins got 35.96% of the vote, and Gonzalez took home 19.47%. It would appear to me that if the voters followed the same path, Higgins is going to win. Higgins is a Miami-Dade County Commissioner who resigned her office to run for mayor. She's emphasized building an affordable and prosperous future. She's touted her successes as county commissioner and invested nearly $3 million in small business grants and investments in building nearly 7,000 affordable housing units. But in an interview with Fox News, Gonzalez, who's an Army veteran, former West Point teacher, and business leader, warned that while Higgins has emphasized affordability in her campaign, her policies would stunt the American dream and keep citizens in perpetual renter status. We're seeing a lot of that these days. Well, scientists have revealed that the one practice that could prevent dementia as you get older, lack of socializing may be a major risk factor for neurological disorders in older adults, according to research. This research from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, has considered how social frailty can be a predictor of dementia. The study was published in the journal Gerontology, looked at data from 851 people over the age of 70 in Sydney's suburbs who did not have dementia at the time. The researchers evaluated social frailty using measures of social support and frequency of social interactions and sense of purpose and engagement in community or volunteer activities. And the individuals perceived social roles and connectedness. That's according to a press release. Based on the analysis, participants were classified as socially frail, pre-frail, or non-frail. Well, it'd be interesting to see how that plays out over the long run. Well, Halle Berry has stunned crowds by criticizing Gavin Newsom, says he probably shouldn't be our next president. And I would tend to agree with that. She called out California Governor Gavin Newsom while delivering a speech about how women are viewed in Hollywood and across America. She took the stage at the Dealbrook Summit Wednesday and spoke about how women are devalued, particularly after they reach a certain age. The Catwoman star drew gasps from the audience while making her pointed comments and referencing Newsom. That's according to a Hollywood Reporter. She said at this stage in her life she has zero effing left to give. Back in my great state of California, my own governor, Gavin Newsom's vetoed our menopause bill not 1 but 2 years in a row. But that's okay because he's not going to be governor forever, and the way he's overlooked women, half the population, by devaluing us, he probably should not be our next president either. Well, at least one of the Hollywood elite is seeing the truth. Well, Richard Gere says the Dalai Lama's words can't change President Trump. And what he's done is astonishing. Actor Richard Gere, who's always chased foreign religions, suggested even the Dalai Lama couldn't change President Trump with the effect he's had on the country. Pretty Woman actor spoke to Variety on Wednesday about his new documentary, Wisdom of Happiness, which features comments from the Dalai Lama, whom Gere considers a very close friend. Gere said hearing Dalai Lama speak on made him reflect on how the U.S. was on the very wrong track, but he doubted that a Tibetan spiritual leader could influence President Trump. He said, I don't know that it could touch him, he said. I'd hope that it would. I'd pray that it would, but I don't know how you explain what he's done to this country. What it feels like to be in America now, 10 or 11 months in. It's just astonishing. It's beyond what anybody could imagine. He encouraged Americans to take responsibility for the leaders they elect and instead support people who could create a better world. If he'd concentrate on doing something good instead of chasing a foreign religion, he might do better. But that's just me. Well, Luigi Mangione has battled to block key evidence a year after the assassination he carried out. Experts say it's a long shot. A year after a gunman ambushed United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson outside a Manhattan hotel, the man accused of killing him is now fighting to block the key evidence police say ties him to the crime. But legal experts say his chances of winning are slim. Lawyers for the alleged assassin, Luigi Mangione, are asking a New York judge to suppress evidence taken from his backpack without a search warrant, including a suspected murder weapon and journals that allegedly shed light on his motives and plans, as well as statements he made before and after his arrest. You know, another thing that he's got in his favor, he's related to Nancy Pelosi, a goddess who has come down to earth. Just ask her, she'll tell you. Well, RFK Jr. has launched an investigation into school for alleged vaccination of a child without parental consent. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy on Wednesday announced an investigation into what he called a troubling incident in which a Midwestern school allegedly vaccinated a child without the parent's consent. In a video statement on X, Kennedy said that Health and Human Services is taking decisive steps to defend parents' rights to guide their children's health decisions after the alleged incident. The school administered a federally funded vaccine to a child without the parent's consent, despite a legally recognized state exemption. And when any institution, school, doctor's office, or a clinic disregards a religious exemption, it just doesn't break trust. It also breaks the law. I was at a doctor's yesterday where they kept trying to give me a vaccination, and I said, thank you kindly, I think I'll pass. Eventually, they had to go with that. Well, the police should be taking a closer look at college student's death after the mother's allegations, according to former prosecutor. Former federal prosecutor said police in Austin, Texas, should be taking a closer look into the death of a Texas A&M University student who was found dead after a rivalry football game. Brianna Aguilera, 19, is found dead at 12:47 a.m. on Saturday at 21 Rio Apartments in Austin after the Texas A&M University versus University of Texas football game. Police in Austin said her death is being investigated as a homicide and said no foul play was suspected, but her mother, Stephanie Rodriguez, believes somebody killed her. And while she said detectives told her Aguilera fell from a 17th floor balcony and her death was accidental or suicide, she doesn't believe her daughter killed herself or had an accident. She said, this was not accidental. Somebody killed my Bree and gave all the group of friends a lot of time to come up with the same story, she said. My daughter wouldn't jump 17 stories from a building, and to be labeled this as a suicide is insane. Well, there have been a number of cases similar to that. Well, according to one of my favorite senators, Senator John Kennedy, Democratic colleagues are out of control. And, of course, he's had a lot of other interesting things to say. Well, an Illinois church nativity scene shows baby Jesus zip-tied by ICE agents. I think we're kind of carrying this anti-ICE thing to extremes. Illinois church is facing criticism for displaying a nativity scene that depicts a baby Jesus with its hands zip-tied and guarded by figures stopped immigration and customs enforcement agents. The Lake Street Church of Evanston displaying the scene outside on its grounds. Baby Jesus is wrapped in a thin blanket resembling aluminum foil, which the church said is a reference to the emergency blankets used in detention facilities. And masked centurions, officers in the ancient Roman army, are depicted in sunglasses and green vests labeled ICE. Well, absolutely beyond the pale, frankly. Well, federal probe has targeted alleged Minnesota Somali fraud network as COVID aid crime rings persist. Small Business Administration investigating a network of Somali groups in Minnesota that it says is tied to a massive COVID fraud scandal, highlighting alleged systemic failures by Governor Tim Walz's team to properly audit public funds. Walz, the 2024 Democratic vice presidential nominee, has become embroiled in a scandal that's already led to charges against dozens of people, mostly Somali, and prompted allegations from civil servants and his administration have spoken of retaliation against whistleblowers and institutional negligence. Numerous individuals and nonprofits indicted in the billion-dollar Minnesota COVID fraud scandal, including Feeding Our Future, received SBA loans in addition to other state and federal funding. Small Business Administration Administrator Kelly Loeffler announced on X. She said she's ordered an investigation into the network of Somali organizations and the executives implicated in these schemes. We're looking at a missing $1 billion. Well, President Trump's unveiled historic reset of the Biden fuel rules, tied at $109 billion in savings. All of these leaders praised the move as aligning standards with market realities, which is something the Biden administration just did not do. Well, ex-Prince Andrew has requested major perks in his new home after his royal demotion, according to experts. The king is not looking favorably on it, of course. Well, Virginia Democratic senator says uniformed military may help save us from President Trump. Senator Mark Warner, Democrat of Virginia, said the military might help save us from President Trump during an appearance on MS Now. He previewed questions he plans to ask U.S. Navy Admiral Frank Bradley when Bradley testifies in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Warner serving as vice chair. He's one of the number of Democratic senators who are actually pushing for what I believe is a coup against the president. Well, John Shapiro has called Kamala Harris's book claims about him utter BS in an interview. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro unleashed on former Vice President Kamala Harris during an interview published Wednesday, claimed what the Democratic nominee for president wrote about him in her book was utter BS. During an interview with Atlantic's Tim Alberta, Shapiro denied what Harris alleged in her book, 107 Days, which included discussions of Shapiro and others she vetted to be her running mate. Harris said Shapiro would ask her staff lots of questions, including how he might arrange to get Pennsylvania artists to work on loan from the Smithsonian. She also accused him of wanting to be involved in every decision and said she reminded him a vice president is not a co-president. I mean, we've had a first lady who thought she was co-president. That's Hillary Clinton. All right. Well, and in our final story for today, school children have unearthed a 9,000-year-old treasure. while hunting a forgotten castle. There was a hugely exciting prehistoric artifacts that were uncovered during a hunt for a long-lost Irish castle. Archaeologists in Northern Ireland went out seeking a 400-year-old castle, ended up finding things that are a whole lot older than that, thanks to the kids working with them. An October statement, Queen's University Belfast said that its archaeologists conducted a 2-week excavation to uncover Derry Gonolly Castle in Fermog. Didn't find it, but they found all kinds of other stuff. Well, let's go to our main topic for today. We've been talking about a lot of unusual things that history just turned a blind eye to. And one of those, because I've done a lot of research into the John F. Kennedy assassination, there's been a lot of questions raised about Lyndon Baines Johnson, his vice president and his successor. And, nobody ever set out to destroy Lyndon Baines Johnson with what you might call the fierce determination that Johnson himself has shown his entire life. There was a man who desperately wanted to be believed and respected, while his whole political career is built on the use of what he called the big lie and literally organized fraud. He's a man who coveted popularity with every fiber of his soul, but could never for one moment hesitate to crush underfoot anybody who got in his way. A man who wanted to whom the attainment of power by any and all means is a supreme ambition in his life. And a man unmoved by any principle except that of expediency. This man, in his lifetime of public service, managed to amass a private fortune of $14 million. He had callously sacrificed millions of lives in order to win the most senseless war in history. He was the main architect of the Vietnam War. And such a person can't succeed in the long run in anything but self-destruction. In the generation of the previous generation, the greatest generation as it's called, Hitler and Mussolini set the pattern, and Lyndon Johnson ideologies apart followed in their footsteps. And so the 36th president of the United States will go down in history as one of the most unloved and unlamented, if not indeed the most unloved and unlamented of American presidents. In striking contrast to what you might call the near-exalted status of his predecessor, John F. Kennedy. Now, for a lot of years, the world has believed and been beguiled about the true nature of the Johnson regime by the horde of professional sycophants, parasites, and myth-makers, which operate out of Washington, D.C. Regrettably, this group, which will glorify any president sight unseen as long as he holds the reins of power and the purse strings, also includes a big section of the foreign press in Washington. And even some of the shrewdest and most knowledgeable observers in that capital have at times eulogized Johnson with a effusion which one finds hard to credit solely to genuine conviction. Take, for example, the story that Henry Farley published in the Sunday Telegraph, October 10th, 1965, with the headline, "Lyndon, the Leader Extraordinary." And among the passages in that particular write-up was, he was harried by such an irrelevant comment, but he wrote it, and this has never been adequately acknowledged, with calm and common sense. The result has been the growth of an easy and normal relationship between him and the country. Relationship without exaggeration, without charisma, without too much sensitivity on either side. Well, the continuity with which Johnson made his first and main task to establish after Dallas was not only a striking and personal achievement for that moment, it shaped American politics for the previous 2 years. And at least as important as the style of the presidential leadership in public is the exercise of that leadership within the administration itself and within Congress. It's impossible to have any contact with any department or bureau of the administration without realizing that each of them is now working directly and sensitively to the leadership from the White House, which it understands. It's a leadership which is personal in terms both of Mr. Johnson himself and of a staff which would be disjointed if he had to be replaced. Well, if the presidential leadership in the previous 2 years have been exceptional, according to this write-up, the fact remains that what matters and what one looks forward to with fascination is the growth of that leadership in the next 3 years. It's a common observation that a president meets his real test, his greatest challenge, and greatest opportunities in the second and third year of his term. It's a matter of speculation, but a speculation which excites only optimism. How Mr. Johnson's going to employ the rest of his presidency. What can at least be acknowledged is that as he turns his talents, not to the comparatively obvious task of the past year, but to situations requiring more political intervention, as he makes more and more imaginative use of the responsive administration which he's created, as he becomes more familiar with the handling of foreign affairs, as he moves toward the full exploitation of the politics he's created. In short, as his presidency takes on its full shape, he can prove to be one of the greatest presidents in American history, in ways that have not yet been considered. And compared to these fervent outpourings from Mr. Fraley, what Newsweek magazine reported less than 2 years later in a cover story entitled LBJ in Trouble, Johnson's the first president in U.S. history to be beset simultaneously with a major war abroad and a major rebellion at home, neither of them going well or holding forth any promise of the kind of sudden and dramatic improvement that alone could reverse the rising tide of anger, frustration, and bitterness that is cresting around the White House. He's also a president whose own personality has become an issue in itself, an issue that seems increasingly to be producing almost as much criticism and contention as the war in Vietnam and the atonement in the ghetto. Well, a number of people are interviewed as part of that story. An interviewee out of Pocatello, Idaho, a sprightly grandmother and a good Democrat, said, "I'm beginning to hate that man." In Portland, Oregon, Charles Snowden said, "I've switched. I'll vote for anybody except Johnson." Well, it was a case where you almost respected him or you hated him. There was very little liking left. And so much for what Mr. Fraley has described as the growth of an easy and normal relationship between him and the country. Well, what's happened to Mr. Johnson's popularity is almost unprecedented, according to a number of writers. In the 2 months after his summit talks with Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, the polls showed that 1 in 5 Americans had turned against Johnson. The latest Harris poll and Gallup poll showed only 39% of the country's voters approved of the way the president was handling his job. And that was the man who won the presidency less than 3 years before, but the biggest landslide in U.S. history. Well, you need to keep in mind that his involvement in the Kennedy assassination was never settled, so to speak. In order to convince the country that he had nothing to do with it, he created the Warren Commission and blackmailed Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, into chairing it, even though he didn't want to. And everybody who has sat on the commission was rewarded, such as a future president, or if they became too vocal, disappeared, like Hale Boggs. Well, Lyndon Johnson, according to a lot of writers, never had wisdom, style, or grace. He was possessed of ambitious zeal, dynamic energy, and relentless drive. He was a typical go-getter who combined the craftiness of the political pro with the insatiable appetites of a Southern wheeler-dealer. His leadership, if that term can apply, never amounted to anything but the outstanding ability to manipulate Congress, to bend reluctant senators and representatives to his will, and to pull parliamentary strings to keep the puppets dancing. True statesmanship, as distinct from political trickery, has always been a foreign art to him. And that's the deep underlying reason why the presidency of Lyndon Johnson could never succeed, even though his long career as a congressman was moderately successful. As head of one of the two mightiest nations on earth, he was a poor substitute for Kennedy or even Eisenhower, and even poorer match for Khrushchev or Kosygin. Most effective weapon had been throughout his career an intimate knowledge of the inside workings of the Washington powerhouse, the ability to exert irresistible pressure through secret blackmail, and that peculiar form of persuasion has become to be known as the Johnson treatment. That's a mixture of cajoling and veiled threats and incubus-like oppression, which once was described in those terms by a senator who'd been subjected to it. Well, it's interesting to note that anything that didn't support the Warren Commission's view of the Kennedy assassination, that it was a lone nut gunman, just simply was suppressed. The keep in mind, William Manchester came closer than most people to seeing through the benign public relations mask of Lyndon Johnson. But if you look at the pages of The Death of a President, you wouldn't know it. His knowledge of what really makes Johnson tick is not firsthand. He had little, if any, personal contact with him, but he was able to draw on the vast store of information and impressions available to the Kennedy clan. And if there are two people in the world who really come to know Johnson at close quarters outside his own family, they're Robert and Jacqueline Kennedy. Manchester interviewed both of them at length, and they told him without mincing their words what they thought of the man in the White House. Well, Manchester, having faithfully recorded everything that Kennedy told him, rushed into print with his story years ahead of schedule. They both got panicky and practically forced him to revise his story to the point it was almost unrecognizable. Edward Epstein, the author of Inquest, managed to get hold of a copy of the original unedited manuscript of the Manchester book, then entitled Death of a Lancer, and revealed in a July issue of Commentary in 1967 some of his contents. In his original draft, Manchester, it seems, made some very pungent remarks about Lyndon Johnson that he described, among other things, as a chameleon who constantly changed his loyalties, a Capone, a crafty schemer who has a gaunt, haunted look about him. He also pictured Johnson as a full-fledged hypomaniac and a crafty seducer with 6 nimble hands who can persuade a woman to surrender her favors in the course of a long conversation confined to obscure words. No woman, even a lady, can discern his intentions till the critical moment. According to what he said in the book, by far the most interesting aspect of this matter, though, is Epstein's contention that Manchester's original theme, which gave unity to his book, was the notion that Johnson, his successor, was somehow responsible for the death of his predecessor. This concept, according to Epstein, gave the original melodrama much of its thrust and its such structural coherence as it had. Several quotations from the original draft bear out this contention. At one point in the Lancer version, it said the shattering fact of the assassination is that a Texas murder was made by a Texas president. In another, Kenneth O'Donnell, Kennedy's appointment secretary, is quoted as exclaiming, "They did it. I always knew they'd do it. You couldn't expect anything else from them. They finally made it." Then Manchester made the comment he didn't specify who they were. It was unnecessary. They were Texans, Johnsonians. Well, all of this is a far cry from the version presented by Manchester in the published book, which not only hews to the Warren Report and making Lee Harvey Oswald appear as the sole culprit, but even embellishing on it. For Manchester, in The Death of a President, it goes so far as to tell his readers the exact hour when Oswald went mad, decided to shoot Kennedy, and even implies that the impulse to kill the president overwhelmed Oswald the night because his wife had refused to make love to him. Well, the authenticity of Epstein's disclosures is not in doubt from both Manchester himself and his editor, Evan Thomas of Harper and Row, the man chiefly responsible for total emasculation of the book. They've confirmed the accuracy of the material, the first implicitly and the latter explicitly. And both men, of course, were annoyed. Thompson called Epstein's technique dirty pool, while Manchester complained that it was equivalent to digging in a reporter's wastebasket. What are you going to think about an author who allows his most important work not only to be castrated, but to be turned completely upside down by a publisher more committed to the dictates of expediency than to the search for historical truth? In any event, this is one of the strongest indications yet that the Kennedy family, for all the restraint and even pusillanimity they've exhibited in the matter, have been well aware all along of the true background of the assassination. For a number of years, America's been the victim of fear. She's now, with Johnson, it was said she was ruled by an illegitimate government. defalcation of Congress on the one hand and judicial usurpation on the other, with the connivance and steady support of the executive branch. Federal government's been corrupted into a vehicle that has vast unrestrained power over the lives, the effects, and affairs of the American people. It's just that fateful period in our national life, as if by diabolical design, there had been thrust into the presidential office a man who knows the meaning and the uses of power. Not power based on mutual confidence and consent, but the power of political pressure and of blackmail. So we're faced with illegitimate power in the hands of a ruthless man. Well, those lines came from the preface of what's been considered one of the most remarkable books that's ever been written about the life and times of Lyndon Baines Johnson. It's entitled A Texan Looks at Lyndon and subtitled A Study in Illegitimate Power, published in the summer of 1964 under semi-clandestine circumstances. That's according to the New York Herald Tribune on September 13th, 1964. It achieved an enormous sale throughout America in that election year. The author was J. Evetts Haley, a crusty Texan who describes himself as a cowman and historian who, with his son, is an active cowboy owner-operator of 3 southwestern cattle ranches. And as for the historian part, in this unusual combination, it's presented by 12 books of history and biography concerned with Texans and the Southwest, and documented by the fact that the author was a member of the Department of History at the University of Texas in the mid-30s. Well, in the wake of the publication of that book in June of 1964, there was a book that came out called The Kennedy Murder Fraud, Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy, which contained a chapter entitled Cui Bono. There was a lot of fan mail, which one day included a curious pamphlet with the title LBJ, A Political Biography. It's published by the Liberty Lobby, of all people, a notorious ultra-right outfit. And this pamphlet wouldn't normally have retained any attention, except for the eye-catching unsigned note attached to it. It said, if you want to broaden your speculation on Cui Bono, read this. Well, that pamphlet turned out to be an extract from the book A Texan Looks at Lyndon by J. Evetts Haley. And a number of people read it cover to cover, and since that time it came out, we read it many times. Now, Haley's book may not be a masterpiece in a strictly scholarly sense, and it's certainly not a Bible of any political creed, but as source material, it's invaluable. Author's not only a fellow countryman of Lyndon Baines Johnson, but an insider of Texas politics and an old political pro in his own right. Self-styled Jeffersonian Democrat and conservative, Haley for years has been active in regional politics, and in 1956 sought the Democratic nomination for governor. Well, this biography of Lyndon Johnson is colored by a considerable extent by the bitterness of his own failure. I'm talking about Haley's failure in the political game. Well, it's by an ingrained dislike of the Rooseveltian tradition, which is the tradition that produced LBJ, and a generally ultra-conservative stance. But even after making generous allowance for possible exaggeration due to these factors, there's a lot in that book. So much well-documented fact that it can't possibly be bypassed by anybody seeking enlightenment about the dark recesses of the Johnson story. There's the principal merit of Haley's A Texan Looks at Lyndon lies in exploring parts of Johnson's past that have been most zealously kept from view by the official biographers. In particular, Haley relates in great and obviously authentic detail how Lyndon Johnson got started on his long and crooked road to the White House through a fraudulent vote. Nobody who's closely followed Lyndon Johnson's shifty congressional careers and his ascent to the presidency through a well-planned murder camouflage as the demented actions of a lone communist and endless chain of deceptions that have marked the Vietnam War will doubt that the turbulent runoff primary in 1948 was indeed the blatant vote steal that Haley makes it out to be. Now, Johnson's been a congressman since 1937, failed in his first bid for a Senate seat in 1941, and he was determined not to lose out again when he got into another race 7 years later with the popular Governor Coke Stevenson. That was his opponent in the primary battle, which to all practical purposes decided the election as everywhere in the then still solid South. Final vote on the primary poll, held July 24, 1948, showed Stevenson with 477,077 votes to 405,617 for Johnson, far out in the lead by a seemingly safe margin. But since Stevenson's lead of 71,460 votes did not constitute a majority over the entire field, a runoff had to be held, and it was set for August 28th. Well, during this time frame, Johnson spotted his chance to reverse the comfortable margin majority of his opponent. And in the southwestern portion of Texas, where many people of Mexican parentage live, for the most part, in primitive conditions, the master of an entrenched political machine can easily swing a large controlled vote one way or the other. Some of these Latin-populated counties are ruled in almost medieval fashion by dukes who lorded over vast areas by means of well-established hierarchy of ward healers and jefes politicos. One of these key figures was, in the words of Haley, an affable, blue-eyed multimillionaire criminal by the name of George Parr, Duke of Duval County. The political power and riches inherited from his father, Archie Parr, who'd been for many years a Texas senator. George added a great deal of his own through a variety of shady deals which repeatedly landed him in jail, without damage to political influence and social standing, I might add. At Parr's first trial in 1932 for criminal evasion of income taxes, the federal attorney of San Antonio District, William Robert Smith, proved that George Parr in 1928 had an income of more than $45,000, only $2,700 of which had come from legitimate sources. About $17,000 represented payoffs for protection of illegal liquor and gambling operations and houses of prostitution. The protection provided by Parr in return for these payments was well worth the money, it seems, for the defendants was, in the words of the prosecutor, the political dictator of Duval County, who controlled the action of practically every other office holder in the county. The remaining $25,000 of Parr's 1928 income, according to the U.S. Attorney, represented a kickback on a county road contract which the defendant, as county judge, had thrown into the Pearson Construction Company in return for a $25,000 cash delivered to his home in a little black bag. Uncle Sam didn't get anything in the way of taxes. In the face of the incontrovertible evidence which Smith had mustered against him, Parr gave up and pleaded guilty. Got a $5,000 fine and an 18-month probated sentence. 2 years later, got involved in a fraudulent oil deal. Parr's probation was revoked at that point, and he was sentenced to a federal reformatory. And though Parr had originally been in the Stevenson camp, he found it to his advantage to make a deal with the Johnson forces after the runoff in primary in 1948 had been set. His political influence at the time extended far beyond Duval County, but especially into adjoining Jim Wells and Starr counties. The switch that Parr engineered in his area of influence and control was absolutely fantastic, according to Haley. His immediate Tri-County returns gave Johnson a 30-1 lead, 10,547 to 368. With heavy majorities in many other counties adjacent to him and along the Rio Grande. Needless to say, such an incongruous majority, coming after a fairly even split of votes in the primary held only a few weeks before, is evidence per se of a rigged election. But unfortunately for Stevenson, there was worse to come. When the count from the runoff election was in, according to Haley, Parr had delivered for Lyndon. And even though he had dallied in sending his returns while Lyndon kept in close touch by telephone, finally turned out they had closed their own count prematurely. Stevenson was ahead by 113 votes. Well, Johnson made another phone call to Parr, who indicated he might pick up what they needed in Precinct 13 at Alice, the county seat of Jim Wells. So his henchmen recanvassed the returns, reported on September 3rd the corrected total of 202 additional votes for Johnson and one for Stevenson. So Lyndon went into lead by 87 votes out of nearly a million actually cast. Well, of course, the smell of fraud was strong. Stevenson and his supporters swung into action, accompanied by two of his aides, Callis DeBrille and Jim Gardner, both lawyers and former FBI agents. The governors went to San Diego, the seat of Duval County. And when they called on Parr at his office, they found that Johnson's campaign manager, John Connolly, who later became governor himself, had beat him to it. It's Clyde Wantland, Texas newspaper man and historian, who published a detached account of the matter in the Texas Argus in April of 1962. The story was called The Story of George Parr's Ballot Box Number 13. He said he had arrived the preceding day and was busily cementing the theft, although Parr publicly stated that the runoff in his district was as clean an election as ever been held. And maybe in his district that might have been true. Stevenson demanded that Parr show them the Duval poll list and the returns of the election judges that reported a vote of 4,622 to 38 in favor of Johnson. Parr claimed to be astonished. Why should they ask him? He wasn't an election judge. He didn't know anything about the returns. Well, the Stevenson party had somewhat better luck in Jim Wells County, where in the meantime 2 new men had been elected chairman and secretary of the Democratic Executive Committee. The 2 new party officials took a dim view of the last-minute correction of the returns from Precinct 13 and were already trying to upset this maneuver. And having seen the corrected list with their own eyes and sat on the recount, they told Stevenson that the 202 new names had been added alphabetically in blue ink, whereas the original list was in black ink, clear-cut proof of fraudulent ballot stuffing. The list, though, was not available for Stevenson to inspect. Committee's old secretary, John Hudnall, an employee in Parr's Texas State Bank, kept that list safely stored away in the vault. Now, although it was a public record, Hudnall refused to turn it over for scrutiny. What followed then comes close to a scene. Well, as I said, what followed next came close to being a scene from a Western movie. When the bank opened the next day, Governor Stevenson, flanked by his former FBI men and some Texas Rangers headed by Captain Frank Hammer, were there. They were determined to storm the bank. In front of the entrance to the bank, Parr's forces, equipped with Winchesters, were waiting for him. Now, no blood was spilled, though as Watland tells the story, Governor Stevenson widely ordered his forces to appear in public in only their shirt sleeves to prove they were unarmed. As our approached with the bank doors to open, armed men appeared and took positions with a ominous stance. Governor Stevenson and his cultist investigators arrived, escorted by Ranger Captain Frank Hammer. Not a word was spoken as the Ranger captain took position directly in front of the bank doors. Veteran captain is well known by every man there. He's known as a stern and flexible officer and exacted one way or the other prompt and stern obedience to his orders. Waved the armed men to fall back from the back door, and they did. Promptly, I might add. The doors opened, and Governor Stevenson and his men entered. Captain Hammer forbade any others to follow him, and nobody tried. Witnesses later said the captain never listed his pistol, never even touched it. But Johnson charged him with force, threats, and intimidation. Then, according to Haley, citing an affidavit by James Gardner to the Subcommittee on Privileges and Elections of the United States Senate on September 12, 1948, inside that bank, Tom Hudnall produced the list for the Stevenson party to see. DeBrill and Gardner concentrated on the added names, having determined in advance to memorize as many as possible. Hudnall conferred with the county attorney, who after a few minutes gave the opinion that Stevenson should be allowed only to look at the record, not to copy or take notes from it. Hudnall repossessed the record and locked it back up in the bank vault. Gardner and DeBrill hurriedly scribbled down the remembered names left on investigations of their own. They were going to look at the identity and whereabouts of these added voters. They had grave difficulty in locating the addresses they jotted down, except 3 whose last known address was in the cemetery, one of whom, according to church records, had been there for 4 years. At least 2 of those they did locate swore they hadn't voted. Others shrugged off their questions with the frank admission that people in Parr's province who didn't talk prospered better and lived longer than those who did talk. Well, at this juncture, the scene of action shifted to the County Democratic Committee, whose new chairman, Harry Adams, and Secretary H.L. Poole decided to take over the poll list and recertify the returns. And in view of the irregularities that come to light, the 2 party officials planned to eliminate returns from Box 13 altogether, which would have thrown the election to Stevenson. Well, Johnson and Connolly, having gotten wind of the plan, which was said to have been put into force at a full committee meeting on the 10th of September, countered with an extraordinary move. From a friendly judge in faraway Austin, Roy Archer, they obtained an injunction to forbid the county committee to meet and thus stall Stevenson's drive. Johnson's petition and Judge Archer's restraining order are exceptional documents even in Texas jurisprudence, according to Haley. Obviously, Johnson was desperate. He contended he'd received a majority of the votes in the recent election. And he charged that Stevenson, Hammer, and the committee had entered into a conspiracy to have Box 13 thrown out on the grounds of fraud and irregularity, which would take him from enough votes to change the election. Pleading that the resident judge of Jim Wells County can't be reached in sufficient time, Johnson's lawyer applied for a restraining order without notice to the defendants, which Judge Archer granted immediately. Haley pointed out that, in fact, the resident judge, Judge Broder of Alice, was in his district on that day the committee scheduled to meet and was readily available had Johnson desired to talk to him. Well, on that note, it's clear that Johnson got his first Senate seat through fraud and intimidation. We're going to talk more about some of the shenanigans that LBJ was up to in future shows. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show, saying have a truly great evening.